Welcome to Soul of Travel. I am so excited today to be sitting down to speak with Céline Cousteau, one of the people that I put on my list right away when I started Soul of Travel. And ironically, I did so without connecting who you were to who you are. Actually, I just had learned about the Tread Right Foundation and I had learned about CauseCentric, and all of these things were something that really spoke to me. And then I saw the documentary kind of funnel through on LinkedIn, and I'm like, who is this person? I need to know who she is. And so probably very opposite of how most people know of you. But then I had this great experience of then uncovering that you actually had this background with your family and being Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter. And I was like, wow, like she was already cool enough without that. So I just wanted to start with that because I thought that was really interesting. Like I remember actually telling someone about, I'm like, there's this really cool explorer slash like documentarian, and I really hope I get to meet her someday. And then I said your name, and someone was like, oh, is that so-and-so? And I was like, oh my gosh, why did that not even cross my mind? So anyway, that's kind of a funny story to just start on.
I like this version of the story.
For those of you who might also not know, Céline is an environmental activist and storyteller and author, committed to sharing the message of interconnectivity between humans and the natural world. And I think that, again, also this word interconnectivity was this thing that really spoke to me. And so I actually just want to start our conversation there. And I want to ask you, what does interconnectivity mean to you and in your life and in your work and in your being?
That's a great question to start with, actually, because I've been having a lot of conversations around the theme. It's something that has seemed really obvious to me just in the world and how everything interacts, that you can't separate one conversation from living, and you can't separate living from environmental issues and environmental issues from neuroscience and neuroscience from marine biology. For me, it just all is part of a whole. I haven't until recent years really tried to understand what that means to me. And it's becoming a theme in not only in these kinds of conversations, but we're developing an education curriculum around interconnectivity. I am going to start a podcast around this theme. So there's just a lot coming up. And so I'm actually having to dig a little bit deeper into how that is defined. But for me, interconnectivity is, if I'm talking about the work that I do in the Amazon with Indigenous people and their human rights and their land rights, I don't see a difference between their story and why is it that it's relevant to us. A lot of people who ask me, oh, what are your greatest adventures? Where have you been? It's like, well, if I talk to you about Antarctica, I'm going to bring it back to your home. If I'm going to talk to you about the Amazon, I'm going to make it relevant because it always is. Mm-hmm. And so in a very simple way, just to give one example, if you look at the Amazon rainforest ecosystem, about 20% of our oxygen is generated by the Amazon rainforest. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about deforestation, when we talk about Indigenous people, it is directly connected to our breath. So a lot of times I ask people, just think about your breathing. Could you live without that 20%? And if you're going to tell me you can, one, I want to know how you do it. But two, you're now connected to the Amazon, you're now connected to rainforest, and therefore you're connected to Indigenous people because they are the best guardians of that ecosystem. So they are our allies in our very survival. Mm-hmm. So that's just one sort of like simple but big example of what interconnectivity means.
Yeah. I think that this is something that as a child, I always really felt, but didn't know how to put into words. So I really have spent actually probably too much time thinking about this, but like, it's something that I think really at too young of an age. I remember hearing about, even pandemics and rainforest and fires and climate change. And it was just definitely whispers at that point when I was young. But I like immediately started connecting the dots and thinking about how this impacts this and how this impacts this and how can you speak about this without thinking about this. And it becomes very overwhelming really quickly. Yeah. I'm sure you've also spent time in that space because once you kind of see that web it's really hard to stay in one place, I guess, because you're trying to focus on this one thing or this experience or this project, but intrinsically all these other things are a part of it, and so sometimes it's hard to really just stay grounded into one moment and one place. I don't know if that resonates with you.
No, it makes complete sense. I mean, it's, and that's part of the I guess the puzzle of interconnectivity is that how can you separate any conversation, any subject, any item? And so the mind that does that makes those connections is going to need to probably compartmentalize a bit more, because not everybody's ready to have that full blown out conversation immediately. Otherwise, it can look chaotic. This is actually a new sort of task of mine right now, is how to translate all of that into a way that's much more cohesive for an audience. I'm sorry, my cat's probably going to entertain us with his song. But if you look at the sort of the scope of work that I do, and I get asked, like, what's your title? I'm like, I don't know what to give people as a title, because I've designed jewelry and I have designed sculpture and I do documentary films and I do conferences and I've written a book, but all of that is just a different form. The point is what you were saying is the point is to connect humans in the environment. But how can we do that if we don't understand that it's all cohesive, right? It's all part of a bigger whole. And so sometimes you have to give sort of piecemeal bits of information. Another way to look at it, and this is how we're doing it with our education program that we're still building, so it's not available yet, is if you look at a 3D model, and they have these for kids, right? Where you have sticks and little round parts, and you can connect all of it together in this 3D model. So if you look at each one of those balls, these connector bits as a subject, right? Whether it's environmentalism or human rights or our food systems or biodiversity, and you create a line between the two of them, right? So you're connecting them. Well, that connection is then going to bring you to another point, to another connection, to another point. So that 3D model to me is a very simple way of explaining how the system of interconnectivity works. And if you start to take it apart, you start to realize where the weak points are. So if you take one of the sticks away, it's like, okay, well, it's a bit wobbly. If you take one of the round bits away, there's no connector. So the energy can't move through. And that's our world. That's just where we exist. It's not even a question of saying, does it matter or not? It's like, this is just the way it is.
Yeah. Oh, that's a brilliant imagery, I think, because it is sometimes for me just a feeling, and so it's hard to put it into context. Well, from there, I want to kind of go into a little bit of your background. I think that many people might think, given your family, that your path to this work was maybe a straight path, but I have discovered from all of my interviews that never seems to be true. It's like, much like you just said, sculpture, art, environmental, and you think, how does this come together? And I always see that through travel or becoming a part of a global community, that much like interconnectivity, right? Like it all of a sudden makes sense, because actually you have to kind of go through this experience to understand this experience, and this to understand that experience. But I'm wondering for you, when did you kind of realize that this was the path that you wanted to be on? And I also think it's kind of unique because, like, for me, realizing that I wanted to be engaged as an activist and working with women in countries around the world and all of this, I kind of had to uncover this path because it wasn't one that was available to me. But you didn't really have to uncover it, but you still had to discover that it was yours. So what was that like for you?
I like that, uncover and discover. So I think that if you were just to look, I mean, you dug a little bit deeper, but if one were just to look at sort of my family lineage and what I'm doing now, to most people, it would just seem like, oh yeah, you just continued to do what your family's done. It's like, well, actually, yes and no. So the yes part is that I am working in the environmental realm, and towards the end, especially of my grandfather's life and then my father's life, that's really the focus was mostly oceans and the protection of ocean ecosystems. So advocacy and different kinds of inspirational films and books, etc. My undergraduate studies were psychology. And I was just really interested in how humans function, how we think, why we behave the way we do, how are we influenced, how we make our decisions and choices. And I had a minor in art. So there comes the artistic thread to it. Mm-hmm. When I finished my degree, I worked in a psychiatric hospital, and I worked in a home for schizophrenic patients who were transitioning from hospital care to independence. And I enjoyed doing it, but I realized it wasn't my career path. It was more, I hope I'm the eternal student, always kind of absorbing more information and integrating it into how I function and what I do. I went on to actually study in Florence, Italy, and did much more work towards the artistic side of things, doing sculptures, photography, and jewelry. And my master's degree was in intercultural relations, so it was international and intercultural management, because I was interested in, the fact that I travel quite a bit. And when you travel in other countries, you function in different ways, but you bring yourself, your culture, your story with you. So do you completely adapt and morph into the place that you go, or are you rigidly who you are? And how do those two things function? That was mostly in the business sense of things, where corporations would send their employees overseas. And one of the main reasons they would come home early is because they weren't able to adapt to the local business culture. I didn't go on to actually implement my master's in any kind of career, but I ended up doing my master's thesis in youth empowerment through community projects. So I had moved to Costa Rica at the time to do an internship for my master's, discovered this community of kids who had just on their little island created a school for themselves because they wanted to learn. And bit by bit, that led me down a different path. I was a biking and hiking guide for 6 years. And while I was doing that, I was also starting to work on expeditions with my father. So he started to do a series for PBS called Ocean Adventures. I was good at logistics. And I said, if I'm doing logistics for tourism, I can do logistics for productions. And lo and behold, I got shoved in front of the camera to do interviews. I was comfortable doing so just because I have an innate curiosity and just ask the questions regardless of not being an expert in anything. And I loved being out in the fields and the storytelling component. This goes back to psychology, because interviewing somebody, whether I'm interviewing a cetacea specialist or the CEO of an oil company, I need to approach the conversation with their life in mind so I can get the information I need to weave the story together. Mm-hmm. So that kind of brought me back many years later to the work of my family, which was creating documentary films. But the me within that remained, and the interest of putting the human at the middle of the environmental story, and understanding that connection much more than just the environmental story. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, no path is straight. And I think that, when I do speak to university students, for example, the important part, and sometimes I hesitate in saying this, is it doesn't matter what you actually end up doing, but the fact that you're studying something is a tool in your toolbox. Mm-hmm. And when you leave the university, or when you leave high school, or whenever you leave your workshop or whatever it is, that then becomes something you can utilize to build on what you are and what you're going to do. And that creates a more whole human, instead of thinking, well, I studied this, so I have to do this. Mm-hmm. You can do that if that is your passion and you want to give your life to it, 100% do it. So yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of the weaving. There's much more to it, but if I can encourage anybody to, if they have any curiosity in any dimension, is just go and learn. We have so much access now that I didn't when I was growing up, because we have the internet. Right. And we can go really far. Obviously, we can go down not so great rabbit holes too, but we can go really far in a bigger understanding with everything we have access to in terms of experts who just have their words online. Mm-hmm. Right? We're able to watch these amazing interviews and learn and just absorb and be critical about how that's relevant to our lives and what we want to do. So yeah, the zigzag path, I'm always happy to be on that one.
Yeah, I agree. I've kind of been on it as well. And I know that people have been like, how did you start as like a journalism major, and then you have this English lit major, and then you interior design, and then you're back to photojournalism, and then finally landed in sociology. And it's like, well, it's so odd, because actually once I landed in sociology, all of the other parts made sense, because even in my my architecture and furniture for my interior design, like what I really loved was how I took this really cool seminar, and I was like, this tells the story of people through architecture and furniture. Like I'd never thought about it before. And then I looked back and I was like, oh, I've done this with everything. Like I've been looking at it from this sociological lens that I just didn't know I had. And I remember sitting for the first time in like a Sociology 101 class with enough credits to have graduated twice. And she started speaking and I was like, oh my gosh, how to come it took so long to get here. And yet like I wouldn't have known I was there if I had started with that class my first day, my freshman year of college. And so I think that zigzag is really, really valuable because you can just be like, nope, not that. Oh, yes, this. And then you like put that in your bag and you go to the next thing. And then all of a sudden, like you said, you have this much broader understanding. And while it doesn't seem like the dots are connected at the time, like it really is critical to where you're going. So
I think this is where, and I love that you did that and that you came to the understanding that had you taken that class earlier, it wouldn't have been as relevant to you. And you know, often we talk about, what is it? Hindsight is 2020. I don't think that's hindsight is 2020. I think it's just hindsight allows you to make sense of everything. Is you just look back and you're like, oh, that's why I did that. Oh, that's how that fits in. Even the mistakes, even the errors, whether they're errors you know, in your work path or in your judgment or in your choices, that's all part of the learning process to make you realize like, yes, no, and then the maybes, right? And then you can always revisit those maybes like, oh, now I see how it fits in. I love that.
Yeah, and I think it's really valuable for people who might be listening to just give themselves permission to wander, because I think especially in Western society, like this A, B, C, D, E goal is what we are taught, and not this like AQR square yellow, which is where I felt like I was.
I like that. Like, AQR square yellow.
I'm getting there. Well, the next thing I would love to talk about, I know you mentioned both your grandfather's work and your father's work, but with this being a story that talks about women in our lives and adventures, I would really love to talk about how your mother and your grandmother inspired you. And I also wondered when I was thinking about it, if they hadn't been as adventurous of spirits as they were, even in the context of your family, if you would have still felt like this kind of path was open to you. So that's where I'd love to go next.
Yeah, thank you for that. So my grandmother was always behind the scenes, behind the camera. I often equate my grandfather as sort of the pinnacle of the iceberg, right? That's the piece that we see. That's the one that gets photographed. It's the one that gets talked about. And yeah, we mention the other 90%, but we don't actually really go underwater a lot to take a look at what it's all about. My grandmother was a cornerstone of my grandfather's work, in his ability to start his work, because she supported him in what she was doing, in what he was doing. I mean, she sold all of her, you know, silverware and jewelry so that he could refurbish his ship so they could go on these grand adventures. And she was on the expeditions more than anybody else in my family. She would essentially leave with the ship and only come home when the ship came home. And that to me is really significant because it was a dedication of her life and her way of being. It wasn't the career to just do a documentary film. It's because that's who she was. And so for me, just having seen her go off on, you know, all of these adventures, but she never came home and had these long conversations about it. She didn't feel the need to, sorry, there's words in French coming out of my brain right now. She didn't really feel the need to show off these things because it was just who she was. And so, you know, this cornerstone, this pillar, petite French woman, was for me just a symbol of not necessarily what was possible, because we understand now that in analyzing that kind of position in life, but almost like a strength or a calmness in understanding who you are. And that's exactly who she was. I had a lovely relationship with her that was completely separate from you know, the crew that worked on the ship or the rest of my family, because I was a granddaughter. I wasn't I didn't have a different relationship with her. And so my stories with her are, I guess, both intimate and tender. And then at the same time, seeing like my grandmother going off for like 6 months on expedition. Okay. It just was normal.
Mm-hmm.
My mom was an expedition photographer for about 13 years. And starting when I was 9 years old, she would leave for about 3 months out of the year. And she was on the land team doing still photography. And so when I was 9, again, didn't really understand what that meant, except that I didn't have my mom around for 3 months at a time. Now looking back on it, I'm like, gosh, she's kind of badass. Like, another petite French woman, like off on an all male team, not really knowing what the conditions were. And to make it relative to the time, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, there's no WhatsApp and FaceTime and everything else that we now are so accustomed to. So, she had to leave her kids behind for a life that she really believed in, that she was really passionate about. That's a sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And when she would get to a hotel from time to time, she would call. So that, I think, for me was a real symbol of strength and courage to follow what you really believe in, knowing very well that on the other side, you do have to make sacrifices, but that they will be understood because they come from a place of passion and love. Mm-hmm. And so that also was a part of what I grew up with, is the ability to see that, as women, it's really hard for us to have a family and have this like sort of expansive life that takes us away from home. It gets questioned more than men gets questioned. I mean, I get the question of like, how can you leave your son? Are you okay with it? And I'm like, would you actually ask his dad that? Would you actually ask? So we get a different judgment and a different eye on it. And it is hard. I mean, in the days before, excuse me, my mom would go travel, she was telling me just most recently, she was like, it was agonizing. And I have the same feeling of like, it's really agonizing as I'm packing my bag to think like, and I don't leave for 3 months. I would leave for 2 to 5 weeks. But just the idea of being away from my child, there's the mom guilt to it. And yet I have a son who is very secure, who is quite independent, who knows that he is loved beyond love, and who understands that when you are doing something, and I'm going to say for the greater good without this being, patting anybody on the back, but he gets it. He really understands it. And that goes back to interconnectivity. He knows that the work that I'm doing is connected to something else that is a greater good, that is also about him. And because I explained it to him, he's like, you're going to the Amazon. I'm like, yes. He's like, you're going to Amazon to protect people. I'm like, that's what I'm trying to do. He's like, okay. He gets it. And this is where this sense of community, you said that word earlier, I don't remember in the context, but this sense of community then becomes much greater. It's not just those in your home. It's much bigger than we are. And sometimes in order to get that message across, unfortunately, you have to make some sacrifices. I, for one, have really enjoyed not traveling as much for the past 18, 24 months, but traveling more thoughtfully and measuring my impact in those travels, really being able to look at, is it worth it for me to move my body to a completely different place, to put myself under stress, to be away from my son. And those decisions I measure more carefully now.
Yeah, I think this year has definitely created the space to examine that. I mean, obviously we've had to examine that. And I have really thought about that a lot as well with travel and the balance of how do we do this work that inherently takes us away when we have children, and then the same questions like, if I were not the mother, would this be a question at all? And then I am the mother, then the mother guilt starts to lay in there, and you're like, wow, this becomes this really messy dialogue pretty quickly that I'm having every time I try to travel. So I love hearing that. I don't love hearing that. I appreciate hearing that that is something that you are also having to navigate. I actually had that when I listened to the documentary. You were talking about how when you were in the Amazon, a part of you is always home, and when you're at home, a part of you is always in the Amazon. And I know like part of that is always like it's hard to fully disconnect and fully immerse. And then there's also kind of that like traveler's guilt a little bit that you have when you leave and you've seen the thing that you need to, you need to do, but then you get back home and it starts to disappear, and then you get there and then you're like, oh, but my kids are doing this thing, and so you become really stretched. And so that's one of those things that I actually had wanted to talk to you about, is like, how do you find that balance? And are you able to then set up a boundary for yourself and be like, okay, I know when I am present at home, this is what I'm committing to, while this is kind of in the background, and then when I'm there on site, and then it's a little, again, like this interconnectivity is going to just probably keep coming up, but it's always happening simultaneously, so we can't unlink it, but can we create space for like both realities at the same time?
Part of it is about being present, and that's, you know, again, something that has come up in more recent times, and that has been a focus of mine, is to be a lot more present when I'm physically present, and to not have my attention elsewhere. So during my workday, I'm working, I'm focused, I'm trying to get things done. If I'm home and my son is home, I'm focused on the family nucleus. If I am in the Amazon in the middle of the jungle, I'm focused on what I'm doing there. It doesn't mean that the other things don't exist. It just means that you're going to, it's almost take advantage of the time that you have where you are, and really make the most of it. I've said this in another way, in conversation about going to all these different conferences and talking about this, that, and the other. And when people ask me to travel for work, I'm like, make this travel worth it. Let's, if I'm going to go from this place to this place, how much can we get done in that time? Like, let's just not dilly-dally. Like, don't, and I say it, don't waste my time, but I really mean don't waste our potential of what we're able to do. So I guess one part of the answer to your question is to just be really focused and present in where you are. I have in very recent times started meditating, and I have to say, like, that has really helped me in calming sort of my monkey mind, the chaos of like the number of things that are going on and in my own life, and the things that I want to do, and the different projects, and the people I need to talk to, and the emails, and the texts, and the WhatsApp, and the this and that. Okay, let's start the day at just like a lower hum, because my brain is always at a really high one. And I have found that has calmed my nervous system enough where I can be more present. I can be more here. Doesn't mean I'm not doing what I'm, you know, meant to do elsewhere. And it gives perspective and taking a step back and not just being frantic. I hadn't thought about this connection, but it's all coming up. So one person that I work closely with in the Brazilian Amazon is a man named Beto Marubo, and he's from the Marubo tribe, which is in the Brazilian Amazon, and is at the center of a lot of my work, as you have mentioned. He's the one that asked me to do the film Tribes on the Edge. And I just remember, you know, in my very sort of Western way, when something happens, even when COVID was going on, it's like, I'm sort of, you know, texting him, WhatsApping frantically, like, what can we do? Or da, 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 da. And years ago, he said this to me. I was like, Beto, we need to move faster. We need to protect. We need to defend. We need to this and that. And he's like, Céline, calm down. He said, look, this problem didn't happen overnight. You by yourself aren't going to solve it overnight. He's like, so take a deep breath. We need you here for the marathon. And this is coming from somebody who can also look at me in the eye and say, my generation will disappear. We're not doing this for us. We're doing it for the next generation, because I don't want my people to go extinct. So I think in our societies, we see the urgency of the message of extinction and we panic. And so we want to do everything really quickly, and we want to put Band-Aids on it, but we're not actually fixing it for the long term. We're just fixing it for our generation or our consciousness to feel like we've done something. The long term is about looking 7 generations down. Yeah. And this is not coming from me. This is Native American knowledge that talks about 7 generations. And if you do things thinking far into the future, if you can't think 7, think 2 or 3, then we're going to make the right choices. Yeah. So there you go. Another interconnectivity across history and time.
Yeah, I know. I really already knew that was where we would begin and end, and probably figured we'd spend a lot of time in the middle, because I just feel like it is, I mean, it is life. So like, how can you help but get away from that that component. I think I'm going to go back to you just mentioned Beto and him asking you coming to tell the story. So let's go ahead and move to that part of your journey and Tribes on the Edge. I know this, again, for me, as you, like the universe started dropping hints of your work into my life, this was something that really caught my eye. I have had this like force kind of pulling me towards Indigenous communities, like well before I even understood. I remember watching films and just being like, this is the thing, or like picking up a National Geographic and just like feeling this nudge that was like, this is the question, this is the journey, and really being little and being like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but like I really heard that call, and I have kind of felt that like when I travel, I feel such a sense of home and belonging, when I am like blessed with sitting in circle in a tribe, and like this longing to reconnect to earth, and like also this kind of prophetic sense of like, this is where we're also going, and that this is this circle that we're on. And so I just was wondering for you, like what does that connection mean to you? Like, I feel like there's something deeper for you as well, beyond just this ask to tell this story, but there was something that already brought you to this story in the first place.
Yeah. And I just love what you said about when you're traveling and you're sitting in circle, you feel a profound sense of belonging. And I think that that's a natural human need. And we're not necessarily recognizing that a lot of our behaviors are moving towards that. Who do we choose to spend time with? What activities? What do we choose to do with our time? And a lot of that is because we are looking for our people in our community. To be able to have the privilege of travel and experience that in places and cultures that perhaps are not our own at all, for me, just kind of highlights once more, it's not just about where you are and who you spend your time with. It's about an understanding that there's other places that are community to you, because something resonates within you in those moments. And that was a little bit the case for me in the Amazon. Is I get asked, like, why the Amazon? I mean, with the family heritage that I have, the legacy that I carry, why not oceans? I'm like, well, I mean, sure. You know, if somebody asked me to do dolphins in the Bahamas, that might have been an easier story to tell. But this story chose me, and it chose me because I was open to it. So my grandfather first went, I know you know the story, but just for everybody else, that my grandfather first went to the Amazon in the early 1980s. And at that time, you know, once more, you left for a year and a half, 2 years. It wasn't just a quick expedition and back. And I was 9 years old at the time and had the opportunity of spending a couple of weeks there. What that did to me, I mean, I can't say I was a child, but I vividly remember the senses. I vividly remember these moments and these sensations, and you know, something that I ate and the feeling I had. 25 years later, we went back with my father, and my brother was on the team as well, to do for the Ocean Adventure series for PBS, a film called Return to the Amazon. And on that occasion, I was able to go to the Javari territory in the Brazilian Amazon, because we were documenting what had happened in 25 years with many different subjects. And that's when I found out just the dire health issues that are happening there. They have a 50 to 80% hepatitis rate. Malaria is rampant. Illegal activities are destroying the land. There's the largest number of uncontacted people in the entire Amazon live in that indigenous territory. And I knew when I left that I wanted to do something more. I just wasn't sure what it was. I just felt like you see these dire situations on the news or in documentaries, but when you're in the midst of it, sitting around a fire, as you talked about, it just becomes part of you. I had wanted to put together a health program, but I was living in the United States at the time. I don't have any connections in the healthcare system. And, you know, after a year, I realized, like, I can't do this. I'm not the right person to create this kind of program, which was a really hard decision to make, to stop that effort. So that was in 2008 at that point. In 2010, I get an email from Beto Marubo who says, we want you to come back to tell our story to the world. We want the world to know we exist. And I said yes, having no idea whatsoever what I was getting into, how I was going to do it, if it was going to be a 5-minute film. It turned into my first theatrical length documentary film, which was done completely independently and nonprofit. I spent 3 years filming, just as many years in post-production. And over the course of time, it was about telling their story, not selling it. And so I didn't want to. I know what happens in the editing room. You can make anything of a film that you shot in the field into something different by creative editing. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to honor their trust in me. So Tribes on the Edge took a really long time to make. And it's available on streaming in the United States, and we're now negotiating international. But it was really, and what I've realized now is creating that story was really a catalyst to doing more. Creating that story was about challenging my conviction that I was able to do it, and to do it with honor. And so every time I got knocked down because I couldn't find funding or it was too difficult or for whatever reason, you stand back up stronger. Like there is really something to it. So the film has served as a catalyst to having conversations, to giving more conferences, to creating an education curriculum with the College of William and Mary, which is what we're doing now. And we, in the past 18 months, I co-founded an organization called the Javari Project, which is about bringing tangible support back to the Indigenous people, including in health. So it has taken me over a decade from the time that I first went there. But as Beto said, nothing happens overnight. And I kind of feel like, this is just that zigzag path that had to happen in order to get to this point, and the right moment in time as well. So the Javari Project is about bringing healthcare in terms of malaria with medicinal plants. And we're looking at how can we boost the liver immune system to be able to support them through hepatitis, because we're not able to do a vaccination program, but we could use medicinal plants to help with liver function. We're doing a biodiversity analysis to understand what's at risk with all of the illegal activities in terms of the biodiversity. And then to also show in parallel to that, and this is true, it's a statistic, there's actually less deforestation on Indigenous land than there is on conservation land. So the presence of people actually supports nature. And the third component is livelihoods. How can we help support them in the way in which they choose to live, whether it's through language and culture preservation or through independent economic activities, so that they're able to continue to preserve their land for themselves. There's a lot more to it. I'm going to stop there because that's already quite a bit in the journey of Tribes on the Edge. Yeah. But again, you look back and you're like, oh, that's why I spent 7 years doing that film. Right. Now I understand. Yeah.
I mean, I had all of that on my list, so don't feel like you went anywhere I wasn't already planning to go. So perfect. But I think I get also for people who are listening, like seeing that, well, you initially said like we see this thing, we want to take action, we want like an immediate result, and that is definitely culturally driven. Like that's again, like bing bang boom, like that's how we do it. And to like see the thing and then also not even know what the response should be is so uncomfortable that a lot of times people walk away. It's very difficult to sit in that space, and some people they can't sit with that level of discomfort. So I'm so grateful for people like you that kind of can navigate through that or hold space for that discomfort, because it's a part of this journey. And then to know that it is going to take time. And so it's so great that you are doing this with a person who is wisely guiding you to allow for it to take the time that it needs to take, because I think that's a real struggle for most people as well, is like we really just want to achieve this goal yesterday and not go through the journey. And the journey is really often the really important part. The goal is just when it's done, like you almost don't even want to get there, right? Sometimes, because you're like, then what? Like, this is what I've been working towards. And if I don't spend the time in that process, I'm going to have missed everything. And you get to the end and you're like, now what? And that's like, you don't spend time usually celebrating the goal. Like you're like, I've achieved the goal, yay, next thing. And so we have to learn to be in the process. So this is
That's
such
also
a
very
cool
cultural.
example.
It's very cultural, as you're alluding to, is that it's almost like a to-do list of, okay, I've accomplished that. You're not building a table, you're not baking a cake,
Yeah.
right? The kind of work that we do in terms of environmental protection, humanitarian, or in shifting consciousness, and in helping people work through the discomfort and say, this is part of the process, this is part of the journey. That's lifelong, that's ongoing. And that's beautiful that it is. And I agree with you, celebrating whether it's small accomplishments or goals, or getting up every morning and meditating, or getting up every morning and drinking a glass of water before the rest. Those are moments that we should really cherish and say, okay, these are steps to something much bigger, and that much bigger is way beyond us. It's way beyond us. You make me think of ceremony and ritual. This goes back to you going out there and saying, sitting around in this community, I feel a sense of belonging. It also goes back to our sort of human need to belong to something greater than self, or a group of people at least, or an activity. We have been missing ceremony and rituals in our lives. We have alienated ourselves from it. And so what do? We used to, pre-COVID, go out to the bar drinking with our friends every Friday night, or we go camping, or we go celebrate this. But doing that on a regular basis and coming together and sort of having communion and community, I think is part of our illness, is that we're missing that. I think if we had more of that, we would find that we would weave those interconnections on a more regular basis.
Yeah. Just as you were saying that, I was reflecting, and I remember when I was young, I read a lot of Judy Blume books, and I remember being really obsessed with, I grew up in Montana. So I grew up in a very, like, I always said, why don't we have culture? This is what I said as a young kid. So you knew that I was going to be like where I am now, I guess, if you had a predicting ability to predict. But I was like, what's a Jewish religion? Like, look at these ceremonies, look at these traditions. And I was entranced. I was mesmerized about these things that brought community together, and this like deeper connection that rituals and religion brought to a community. Also, sociological lens here, probably, that I didn't realize. And then I grew up on a reservation as well. So there were parts of me that really identified with, again, with those ceremonies and traditions. And I kind of like ached. I was desperate to be a part of it. And yet I also, because of where I lived, wasn't really allowed to be a part of it. And so there was always this dissonance. And I think that's probably part of the catalyst for my journey, is that I just really felt like this was something that should be a part of everybody's life, and was going to be like what we needed most. Like there was just some foreshadowing of this moment in time. And it is also very, very powerful to watch Tribes on the Edge. Like, obviously you didn't plan for it to take this long to come into being, but to watch that now and watch that during this pandemic, I kind of was watching it with this sense again of where I was this young person thinking, like, if we don't look at this now, this is where we're going to be in the future. But like, that we are all, the human race is this tribe on the edge. And like, I'm sure that's not lost on you, but like, I don't even have a question, but how does that unfold for you?
Well, so the title was very intentional, and you totally got it. It wasn't just about them, it's about us. It is about the human tribe. And I mean, you can't put everything in an hour and a half. But with a thoughtful title, you can hint to what it's about. And for those who will see it, it's obvious that the Indigenous people that are in the film are on the edge. But it's us, it's our story. And I feel like if we have any kind of opportunities with what's happened in the past 18 months and how the entire world has been impacted. And I'm not the only one to have said this. I mean, I've heard it time and again. this is actually a pretty amazing opportunity for us to reflect through the pain, because people have lost loved ones, because people have lost jobs, because there are people who've committed suicide, because there has been depression, because the elderly have been isolated. It goes back to the sense of our common future and what it means to belong and what it means to have community, and again, the interconnectedness of all things, because, you know, regardless of how and where this started, everybody was impacted. That is the future of this planet. There is no more obvious way to show it than with a virus. So, you know, I've been asked, like, you know, if I'm hopeful that this will have changed people's minds, and it's like, well, I mean, I think humans are still human, like it's not going to change, and there's all kinds of people, but I do feel that there is a group of people that have perhaps been questioning or curious before, that now are sort of ready for, I was going to say amplitude. Interesting, that word's coming up. Not a word I've ever used, but that are ready for something greater than themselves. And that curiosity, I think, is where we have a gift right now in order to reconnect people with themselves, with others, and with nature. My path, my zigzaggy path, has really started with, well, it started with psychology, right? So the inner mind and self. But it really took another journey in this connection with nature. And I feel now what's happening for me, at least, and where my interest is coming back to, is we actually need to come back to this connectedness we have with ourselves, with our mind and our body and our soul, to fully understand we all have trauma, whether we know it or not. Where does it sit in our body? How can we heal that so we can have better relations? And if we have better relations with self and others, we will have a better relation with the planet, with nature, with the environment, because it is completely interconnected. But if we're disconnected with ourselves, then we start to disconnect really with the true nature of others. And therefore, how can we ask people to connect to nature? Because it will just seem as something utilitarian. It's like, oh, well, nature serves a purpose. It's like, yes, but you are nature. That's the thing. So maybe, you know, maybe this whole era is giving me hope that this can be an opportunity. This can be an opportunity for people to really take a look at what matters.
Yeah, I definitely have sat in that same space of like witnessing this deep connection and feeling like this powerful sense of like overwhelm and loss, and then like the next deep breath is like opportunity. And it's like, it's so weird to have those next to each other, but it does seem like it's shining a light on what is possible. And so I hope more than anything that this period of time allows more people to witness that and to be able to kind of step into whatever that next phase of living and being is. When you were also just speaking, you talked about shifting human consciousness. And when you look at bringing all of your passions together and all of the pieces of your life and all of the work that you're doing, I know that you've said that when you reflect that seems to be like, that's really what your work is. Like, it's all these other pieces, but in order to get there, or at the end of the day, or that's where you're headed, or that's where your heart lies. Would you like to share a little bit about what that means to you?
Yeah, so I've questioned over time if I should keep focusing on documentary films, or if I should allow my artist to explore more, because I've missed it, just for me, but also to share. What I have come to, and I think I've always known this, is I am all those things. And how I bring it together in a cohesive way is my next step, so that it can be understood by me as this, with this connecting thread between all these different projects, but also to be able to share it, because there is so much potential there. There's an interesting, so again, this time has given me opportunity to delve into other subjects, but looking at where you are and what your attributes are. So I sit on the creator side of the spectrum, which means that I need a system around me and with me in order to move things forward. It should be no surprise that that's the way it works. Nobody does anything on their own, but being able to identify those parts enables you to figure out how you can move forward more authentically and effectively in what you do. It's not just for me, this is for anybody. This goes back to how I had described my family earlier in the conversation, in that you see an iceberg and there's, here's this person at the top that you attribute all these things to, but there's an entire system that enables that to happen. And that's what I'm seeing with me, is that I have said for years, first of all, for years, I've said I'm exhausted and I'm kind of done with that scenario, right? It's just like, why do I need to function in a dysfunctional way? Thus the taking a step back perspective, meditation, getting better sleep, all those things. But I've also said, my potential is here, my capacity is down here. I haven't actually created a system that brings the capacity up to where the potential is, to be able to not just do more in terms of like the to-do list, but create more in order to share. So that's, I don't know if this answers the question, but my, I guess, gift in the past 2 years has been one, writing a book, which was a first for me, which was really intense. And I am eternally grateful to my co-author, who was able to take my weeks and weeks of dialogue with her and sort of align it into something, a cohesive writing. But is the ability to take a step back and really assess what's important and what are the missing pieces. And this is something that's that I'm encouraging everyone to do, is that when you need help, ask for it. It's not something I was taught to do. I think we are, especially in this era of strong, independent women, and we can do all things, and we can raise our kids and have full-time jobs and. Well, actually, no. And that shouldn't be asked of us, and we shouldn't ask that of ourselves. So ask for what you need. And that's something that might be a little bit tough to do when we are wanting to be independent, strong women. But I think it's something that's crucial. And I'm coming to terms with that now, which is, it's humbling, actually, and hard. And I love it. I love the hard stuff because you grow out of it.
Such the image of the peak. I'm drawn to the mountain or the wave, but this is how I often describe travel, is that as travel consumers, we just see the tip of the wave, right? But as people who are engaged in travel, we know there's all of these components that are interlinked to create this experience. And it's the environment and people and place and stories and guides and operators and all these things that allow us to get to that point. And as humans, it's we only like to see the peak. We're really interested in that beautiful wave and that beautiful mountain, but we often ignore what it takes to get there. So I think this has been a really, I love this conversation in bringing some awareness to what it takes to get there, and what that looks like, and what kind of examination that requires. So thank you for sharing that so much. Before we end our conversation, I would love to do 2 things. One is to have you share a little bit how people can learn more about, you mentioned we can watch Tribes on the Edge, streaming it, which I strongly recommend, both as this aspect of being a traveler who enjoys to engage in community in that way. Again, I just have this deep sense of it's beautiful. I mean, I just really appreciated that you did tell the story the way that you did, and didn't edit it into this digestible version of the story. And it's difficult, and it's human. So I really hope that people will take the time to watch it. And then when they do and they want to learn more, where can they reach out to learn about the work that you're doing?
So thank you for that, by the way. The Javari project, as I said, was catalyzed by the film. We don't have our site yet because we really wanted to create the foundation of the organization first. But just keep an eye out for the Javari project. All of this will be connected to Tribes on the Edge website or my website. So my website is simple. It's CelineCousteau.com. It needs an update, but haven't had time. Yeah, that's a good place for it. If people want to support, there's actually a donate space on the Tribes on the Edge, which helps us continue on with our media outreach, our communications, and the education program. Yeah, there's going to be a lot more coming. I mean, it's tough because we didn't talk about any of this, but I have quite a few projects that are in development. And I'm hoping that 22, 23 will be the years where I'm going to be able to share more. Because I think that there's a never ending possibility of doing the work. My encouragement for everybody, beyond what it is that I'm passionate about and what I'm doing is for each person to look at themselves and see what matters to them and do that every day. We have, if we're sitting in front of our computers, we have a computer or a phone. So we have a certain degree of privilege, which means we have access to knowledge and education. So I just encourage everybody to, really look at themselves and try to understand where is it that they can evolve? Where is it that their passions are? And dig into that, because that's going to influence how they see themselves and how they then see the world. And that means they're going to be active participants in moving towards greater change. And that's the biggest thing I can ask, is just for everybody to really do that self-reflection. In the words of Beto Marubo, when somebody in the audience, because I brought him to the US to screen Tribes on the Edge, they said, "How can we help you?" And he said, "Now that you have seen my story, take it forward as your own." And I think that it might not feel like you're creating great change in the world because it's not a tangible thing you can touch, but it matters because you become part of a greater community.
Yeah, I fully and deeply agree. And I believe that's why travel is so important in our lives. It's because it allows us to see that connection and to know that it is one story and that we're all a part of it. So, well, I usually end with a series of rapid fire questions, which I'm really torn with because that was such a beautiful moment that I hate to break away from it. But it's such a fun opportunity for people to get to know you as a traveler. So we'll go there. But really, I appreciate so much what you just shared and this conversation. But as we wrap it up, we'll do this. And they are rapid fire-ish questions. So we'll see how that goes. Okay. But what is your favorite book or movie that offers you a travel escape or inspires you to adventure?
Okay. The first book that came up is The Power of Myth. Which I read last year and completely marked up, and I think is sitting by my bedside somewhere. Movie, my goodness, I'm terrible at movies because I go to like the psychological thrillers.
So they're not really travel inspirations.
Yeah, they're not travel inspirations, but yeah, it's funny. I'll reference my son. He is very much into Egypt right now, so we watch the mystery of the Tutankhamun tomb. So that's kind of my latest dig in is into Egypt, and I promised him a trip when everything calms down, and he chose Egypt. So that will be our next destination.
I can't imagine going there with a kid. It's magical enough, but that would be just brilliant. That's
he's already like this. Yeah.
Yeah. What is always in your suitcase or backpack when you travel?
A journal, my phone. Yeah, something to draw in and write in.
What has been your favorite destination? Is nearly impossible. But. That's
nearly impossible. I don't do favorites. Obviously, I'll cite the Amazon just because I have such a heart connection to it. I recently went to Turkey, which is a totally different place for me, and I'm excited to go back.
Yeah. Where do you still long to visit?
I feel like I need to go back to Patagonia because I've been on the Chilean side. I haven't been on the Argentinian side. And I would love to spend some time in Southeast Asia. It's an area of the world, and I'm just going to say it as a blanket geographical location. It's an area of the world I don't know at all.
Yeah. Oh, it's one of my favorite places. What do you eat that immediately connects you to a place that you've been?
Okay, the first thing you said, what do you eat? I thought of a pomegranate because I'm obsessed with pomegranates right now and have been for years. Yucca is the next thing, and that's manioc, because again, connects me back to the Amazon. When I was 9, I bit into this thing I didn't know, and it wasn't until many years later that I actually bit again into this thing somewhere else, and I was like, oh my God, this is it. And it immediately brought me back to that moment in the middle of the jungle. So manioc, yeah.
I have a really strong connection to that as well, and something I've tried to recreate and cannot do. So it's special for traveling. Who was the person that inspired or encouraged you to set out and explore the world?
There's not one person. I mean, it's, my family, I would say, and continuing to explore would be the people that I meet in the field. Peter Luswata, Patty Webster, Amy Greason, just all the people who are out there doing amazing work.
Yeah. And if you could take an adventure with one person, fictional or real, alive or past, who would it be?
Oh my goodness. The first, gosh, this is going to sound so like typical, but I don't know why I thought of Gandhi. Not somebody that I think about a lot, but for some reason, maybe because I started meditating, I see myself, rather than wandering, actually sitting still.
Yeah, being somewhere and experiencing it in a different
way. Yeah, and I've it doesn't really match, but Nepal in the Himalayas. I've been there a little bit, and I'll go back on your other question. I would go back to Nepal.
Yeah. I love that. It's like you just got a little nudge from the universe right as you were sitting here. So we'll see where that takes
me. We'll see where it takes me.
Well, this has been such a lovely conversation, and I really appreciate you sharing your story with me and my listeners here today.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure, and just a natural journey through the interconnectedness of everything. So thank you.